Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Masterpiece Online and to our talks programme. This afternoon's panel discussion will look at a topic close to my heart, and I'm much looking forward to it. It's entitled Engaging Audiences, Old and New, How to Attract and Inspire Museum Visitors Today. I'm really delighted that so many of you from all quarters of the globe have joined us this evening. Masterpiece, with its ethos of cross-collecting, the careful mixing of works of art from all periods and regions of the globe as a cohesive whole, owes its success to the passion, connoisseurship, and scholarship of our exhibitors. In the absence of our physical fair this year, we are relishing the opportunity to showcase this knowledge to our existing and new audiences through our online talks programs, videos by our exhibitors hosted on our website, and short Instagram TV movies. Discovering about works of art through the voice of a passionate exhibitor is one of the most engaging ways to foster appreciation and knowledge. I strongly recommend that you visit our Masterpiece website and our Masterpiece microsite on the selling platform Artsy, which I hope you will find reflects the character of the physical fair. The website is a really wonderful and exciting way to explore the fair, and I do think you will still find it allows the serendipity and opportunity to discover perhaps unfamiliar works of art that is such a great hallmark of Masterpiece. We are dedicated to supporting our cultural partners who are facing great challenges due to forced closures of public galleries and museums. This year, we are offering unlimited free access to all artworks, conversations and content during Masterpiece Online at masterpiecefair.com. In return, we ask that you consider donating to the Masterpiece Cultural Fund to support museums in the United Kingdom, the United States, and in Asia. And you will find a link to donate included in the chat box. I'm particularly delighted this afternoon to welcome our moderator this afternoon, Melanie Gerlis. Melanie is a renowned journalist writing widely on all aspects of the art market and contributes in particular to the Financial Times. And Melanie, if I may, I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce our very distinguished panelists and to get the proceedings underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masterpiece, for inviting me to moderate this important discussion. I'm very sorry not to be in your fair, especially in the sunshine that London seems to have today. But I'm very glad we have found a way to congregate virtually. It is, to say the least, an interesting time for museums. Even before the current pandemic, they were facing increased questions over their place and their purpose in the 21st century. And with calls for greater transparency and diversity, the challenges are not going away. To address such dynamics, I am delighted to have with me three superb panelists from very different but all illustrious museums. You can probably all show yourselves now, that would be great. I can't physically point them out to you, I'm afraid. Hi, everyone. But their names are there and I'm sure you know them. They are Ulf Burchard, Associate Curator of New York's the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which this week it says, fingers and toes crossed, it will open at the end of August. He is speaking to us today, however, from Connecticut. We also have Tristram Hunt, the Director of London's V&A Museum, speaking to us today from London. And we have Ian Wardropper, Director of New York's the Frick Collection, who today is in the lovely cool breezes of Maine. We will speak for about 40 minutes. If you have questions, as Christian said earlier, there is a function at the bottom, a Q&A function. If you have questions you want me to put to our panel, then please post them there and I will try to pose as many as I can before we close, and hoping to keep all of this to an hour. So without further ado, Ian, can I start with you and with the Frick, because you're undergoing such big changes at the moment. Firstly, could you tell me what you and what the Frick defines as old and new audiences. And then could you tell us, and indeed show us, because I know you've all brought some lovely slides for us to see, but what initiatives you have in place to engage the new portion of those audiences, please?
Thanks, Melanie. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to really reiterate what you and Philip have both said, that these are extraordinary times, the closure that we've had for the last 3 months, and now the urgent social issues raised by Black Lives Matters and others around the world have caused us all to reflect, to think about what we've done well in the past, what we've done poorly, what's changing, and where we want to go. And audience is very much a part of that. As you said, I will talk in a minute about the Frick's change. We are doing some new building, but if I might have the first slide up, I'd like to just talk through a few of the ways in which the Frick has been trying to think about how to reach new audiences. So we're an unusual museum. We are a small collection of masterpieces, which is a word I'm often careful about using, but I'm assuming that in a masterpiece fair panel, I can use the word. And it was formed by one person, Henry Clay Frick, and his daughter had a lot to do with its evolution. It is a specialized collection in the sense that it's an old master collection, predominantly European, from the Renaissance through the 19th century. And we've always been faced with the issue of how to reach our audience. I mean, to begin with, it's a house. You can't duplicate the experience of being there. The works of art are embedded in and are wed to the house. The collection was built for it. So we always encourage people to experience it there. But because we don't have labels to keep the sense of a private dwelling, we've always had the issue of how to get information to people. And so we've had quite a robust website for 25 plus years. We also need to reach as wide an audience as possible, not only a larger audience. We can fit 250 to 300,000 people a year, but not much more. So how do we reach more people in a wider audience? And then perhaps the most pressing question of all is, how do you make old art interesting to a young audience? So I brought a few slides just to sort of illustrate some of the things we've been doing. We have a virtual tour, which is what you're looking at here. We've actually had it for 23 years now. It's just sort of gotten better and better. And you know, there are these amazing things that are happening in the moment when we're all prisoned in our houses and turning more and more to the digital, so that we've had something like an increase of 900% of people who are now looking at our virtual tour. So it's, you know, it is something that does allow people to enter into the Frick virtually and to get information about the collection. But in the end, what I hope is, and what we all hope, is that people will want to come back and see it for themselves in the end. Could I have the second slide? I love that we still use the word slide, even though they don't really slide into a projector anymore. We've been pivoting, that's a word a lot of people are using right now, to the digital. And so, for example, we've had a tremendous popularity with a series called Cocktails with a Curator, which is quite serious, but playful at the same time. It's had as many as 45,000 viewers of one episode, which is quite extraordinary for us. It's spawned imitators and even parodies. There's one of a talking dog about dogs in art, which is really quite funny. But I think what makes it work is that it's quite personal. It's short, it's to the point about a work of art, but it also brings it into play in terms of what we're all thinking about now. So in this particular instance, Turner's Harbor of Dieppe, Turner did a series of port scenes, which became very popular after the embargo of travel during the Napoleonic Wars was lifted, and Britons could once again cross the Channel. So, you know, the same kind of sense one imagines when we can travel again, the kind of exhilaration that will feel. So these are the kinds of programs which we've been putting on kind of really on the spur of the moment. I mean, we shifted to this very quickly over the last 3 months. We've done maybe 8 or 9 of this series. We have 4 other series going. And you see there's a chat panel, so there's a sense of kind of community of people who are watching this. But it poses the very real question of, what do we do in the future? Do we continue this? It's successful, but we only currently have 2 curators, and once they start working on exhibitions and catalogs again, can we keep this going? In what format? These are some of the questions which we need to face. The next slide, please. We've had an app for about 5 years now, which is a very compact way to give information to our audiences. And we're just launching next week a new app. So it's an interesting instance of enlightened philanthropy, I think. The Bloomberg philanthropies, which are very interested in digital initiatives and have supported them in museums around the world, are creating a universal app so that any museum that doesn't perhaps have the personnel or the money will be able to use this as a format. And so we were one of 3 or 4 institutions that kind of worked with Bloomberg to get out the kinks and to see what would work. So, this will be, as we're closed now, and we will be for some 6 months until we open temporarily at the former Whitney building. This will be a way to get information across to people. But in these COVID days, we also will not be able to hand out audio tour devices as we used to. So people will have to bring their own cell phones into museums. And so this will be our platform for audio tours. It will allow us to move very quickly to put new information, to address new audiences. So this is the kind of a way, this is a way forward, I think, for many museums. Next slide, please. So exhibitions, we do small exhibitions at the Frick by and large. I'm a great believer in small exhibitions. I think you can achieve a lot and have quite a powerful exhibition with only a few works of art. And in this instance, we invited Edmund Duval, contemporary artist, to make some works of art in relation to works of old master art in the Frick collection, which is a collection he knows very well. So this is a work he made in response to Duccio's Temptation of Christ. But it was scattered throughout the museum. We've always put our exhibitions online, but this is a virtual exhibition, which also poses interesting questions for the future. And now, I mean, I've seen some exhibitions which I couldn't get to in the last 3 months online, and they, were variously successful. In this instance, you can see a video of Edmund talking about the piece, why he made it, see him making one, listen to pieces of music that inspired him, go through the galleries as you choose. So it's another way which we can sort of think about as we move forward. And the next slide.
Ian, I'm going to ask you to whiz through the next 2 slides if possible.
Yeah, happily. So
thank you.
We also we do cultural partnerships. This is one we've done with an institution called the Ghetto Film School that allows young people who want to learn how to make film to come into the Frick to learn about old masters, how narratives worked, and they can use it in their own filmmaking. They make films related to works of art in the Frick. And then finally, the last slide that I'll show is 2 very different buildings. The Frick 1914, Carrere and Hastings, Marcel Breuer's Whitney building, which is currently occupied by the Metropolitan Museum, and we are taking it over from the Met. It'll be open to the public to see the Frick's collection while we're under construction in early of 2021. And so it allows us to reframe and represent our collection. I think it'd be very interesting you can't fight brutalism is something that we've learned. So we're not going to recreate the Frick. We're going to show it in a very different way, which will allow us to rethink the collections, to reframe it, to think about our audiences when we move back into the 1914 house in 2023. Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure lots of people will be jealous that you started online tours 23 years ago. I think that's pretty impressive. But I really appreciate that, and it's interesting that you define new audiences as younger audiences, which I think is a particular challenge for old masters. And yeah, maybe being at a brutalist building will help. Tristram, can I turn to you now and really ask the same question, but do you also define new audiences as young, or is there something more granular within that? And then if you could also give us some examples of what you've been doing to bring the new audiences in.
Sure. And if we could have the first slide, please. In terms of new audiences for the V&A, yes, it's young people. Yes, it's people from more diverse backgrounds, not only within London, but across the UK. Yes, it's actually families from more disadvantaged communities as well, lower socioeconomic groups as we describe them in economic terms. And it's also a sense really of rebuilding that notion of a national museum as a national collection. And I came from a background in politics into museums with a very strong sensibility that if all taxpayers are paying for an institution, they should have not only the right to walk in and see their collection that they own for themselves, but also feel welcome and honoured in that space. And that absolutely informs what we're doing. And here you can see the V&A in summer. This used to be called the Reflective Pool. Now it's full of young families enjoying the civic space. And if the Frick had that more domestic sensibility initially, the V&A was always consciously civic. And I think what we've done in recent years in terms of finding our feet again is to have total confidence in the founding mission of the institution, which was about ingenuity and imagination, showcasing human ingenuity in order to spark the imagination of the creative community. 40% of visitors to the V&A describe themselves as from the creative industry. So we've always had this very strong functional connection to makers and designers. And so as we think about new audiences, well, today it's going to be digital designers, today it's going to be coders, today it's going to be graphic designers compared to what some of the communities were in the past. So how do we connect to new audiences? Next slide, please. First of all, a total confidence in the collections and the permanent collections, which sit at the heart of the museum. But we have to reimagine them for each new generation. And so you can see here our new Sir Elton John and David Furnish photography gallery, and we've put photography back really at the heart of the museum. Henry Cole, our first founding director, was a great believer in the mix of historicism and modernism and how you use the most advanced technological process to think about the past, and photography and plaster casts were part of that. And then later this year, we will reopen the Raphael galleries where the Raphael cartoons for the celebrated tapestries in the Sistine Chapel sit generously on loan from Her Majesty the Queen, reinterpreted, relit for the 500th anniversary of the death of Raphael. We have a project called Future Plan, and big museums like the V&A, like the Met, like others, you have to ensure that the physical space of the museum is as exciting and invigorating as possible for each new generation to enjoy afresh. And that's a never-ending process that we go through. So that's the first in terms of the collections and the physical sites. The next slide, please, points to a kind of different approach to the brilliant exhibitions at the Frick, and not least Evan Duvall's one, which I thought was a spectacular relationship between the ceramic and the collections there. But the V&A has very much enjoyed, really since its foundation, of doing big, what we would call blockbuster exhibitions. The first exhibition the V&A did in 1863 was the wedding list of the Prince and Princess of Wales. So if anyone ever says we're dumbing down, I say, no. The first exhibition we did was a wedding list exhibition. And here you can see some of the most recent successes, the David Bowie ears, the wonderful Christian Dior. But then you'll also see Opus Anglicanum, which was an account of medieval English embroidery. And you have to have an exhibition cycle which brings in new audiences, but also brings alive the permanent collection in new and different ways. And to my mind, we only get spectacular exhibitions like Christian Dior because we also have Opus Anglicanum, because we also have really important exhibitions which speak to the level of scholarship and learning within the organization. And one of the many sadnesses of the dreaded COVID is we had to cancel a beautiful exhibition on Renaissance watercolors, which the Met and others actually kindly lent to, which was a really beautiful and precise work of scholarship that's been sadly lost. So the exhibition program are very, very important. Next slide, please. When we think about a museum like the V&A, and when we think about some of the current conversations surrounding Black Lives Matters, we have to be absolutely honest and critical with ourselves about our colonial and imperial past. And as we seek to ensure that diverse communities feel a sense of ownership and belonging within the museum, for a museum like ours with such a colonial past, I've absolutely prioritized focusing on those parts of the collection which have difficult prehistory. So we've looked at slave owning wealth within the organization. We've looked at the Ashanti gold weights from contemporary Ghana, which were taken in imperial raids. And here you can see a display on the Magdala collection, which was taken as loot by the British Army in 1868 from modern day Ethiopia. And we're involved in long conversations with the Ethiopian government now about how we share these collections into the future. So you can only, it seems to me, have those conversations that we need to have about the future of the museum if you're totally transparent about the past. We've more work to do there, but it's a rewarding and necessary process. And what we also do is we began a long time Friday Lates. So you are bringing artists, makers, designers, collectives into the museum, opening it up for them, and them reinterpreting the space, bringing new crowds in, along with events such as the London Design Festival. So that kind of programming, enormously important. And then finally, with the last slide, just a look to our future in East London, in Stratford, where the 2012 Olympics took place. We're building 2 new facilities there in the youngest, most diverse, fastest growing community in the UK. We're building a waterfront museum, which is going to be focused on narratives of making and designing a very strong story in East London, which has an incredible history going back to the Industrial Revolution in terms of a design story there. And then also a new collections and research centre where you will be able to walk through the reserve collection of the V&A as a visitor experience. I think so many people now want to get behind the scenes of the museum, and here there will be an opportunity to do so. And one of the wonders, hopefully, of what we're doing in East London is then you have this relationship between South Kensington and East London, and a reflective, reflexive, iterative process where we both energize, equally both sites and think about what that means for the future of the museum, connecting with new and diverse audiences.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tristram. And I suppose for people listening in or tuning in who are not from London, the community, there's a big community difference really between South Kensington and that area of East London. Was that very much in your mind?
Very much so. This was a project I inherited when I joined the V&A 3 years ago, and we've changed it slightly. But the core of it is not only connecting with those communities, but then building a workforce into the future, which shows the people of Newham and Tower Hamlets and Waltham Forest and other communities that they are the future curators, conservators, museum directors, because we're in that community and connected to it. And it's a challenging piece of work, but the great news is we've hired Gus Casely-Hayford, former director of Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian in DC, to be the director of V&A East, and he's already making a tremendous difference.
Super. Well, on that note, we're going to jump back across the Atlantic. So thank you very, very much indeed, Wolf. Again, I'm looking forward to you showing us some of the things that the Met is doing. But again, how are you defining, can you define old? No one has defined old audiences for us yet. How are you defining old and new audiences?
Well, can I have the first slide as I answer?
Perfect.
try and answer the question, I would define the new audiences in the same way that Ian and Tristram have, thinking about young people, but also people who are diverse audiences of diverse backgrounds. And particularly if you think of the city of New York, coming from different boroughs. Of course, the Metropolitan Museum is one of the central pillars of New York's cultural landscape. And what you will find, however, is that the majority of New Yorkers visiting the Met come from Manhattan, when really they should be coming from all the boroughs of New York City. So it's a young, diverse, and inquisitive new audience. And with remarks to the old audience, I think it's always, I'm a great defender, as it were, also of the old traditional audiences, which include those who will have visited the Metropolitan Museum for the last 30 or 40 years, and certainly, you know, the retired and the elderly who do have the time to come to the museum in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, and have the time to engage thoroughly with our collections. And I think it's always extremely important that when trying to attract a wide array of new audiences, one doesn't forget one's you know, other audiences and alienate those. So what I'd like to do now is give you a small presentation, or sort of show you some images relating to one of the many projects that the Met is undergoing in order to attract new audiences. If I could have the next image, please. I want to tell you a little bit about the Met's new British Galleries, which reopened only 10 days before the Met had to close due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as you can imagine, not very many people have actually seen them. And what you see here is are the old galleries. These galleries, this image sort of rather answers the question why the Met would want to redo the British Galleries. They weren't actually that old. They were done in 1995 under the curatorial leadership of my predecessor, as it were, the late William Reader. And they presented, they were very much of their time, and presented British decorative arts as a sort of echo of the Treasure House of Britain exhibition at the National Gallery of Art, celebration of British country house and aristocratic collecting, done at a time when brown furniture was immensely popular and fetched very high prices at auction, but really a subject that is a difficult sell today to a new audience. And it was also the site, and Ian is going to recognize these images, of a wonderful initiative such as the Great Anglomania Show, shown in 2006. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see this green room that, you know, which was a centerpiece of the British Galleries, which were really undervisited over the last couple of years, and that although they occupied prime real estate in the museum. So my predecessor, Eleanor Alcorn, who's now chair of Decorative Arts in Chicago, and Luke Sison, who's now the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum of Cambridge, decided to reinvigorate the dialogue between the Met's amazing collection of British art and our public. And I really would like to take the opportunity to emphasize that the British Galleries are really their brainchild, and it's a project that the new head of department, Sarah Lawrence, and I only took over about a year prior to the reopening. So Luke and Eleanor teamed up with a New York-based design firm called Roman & Williams, who had never worked in a museum context before. They worked on hotels and bars and nightclubs, and here are some examples, and started out as set designers with a great talent for retail and promotional strategies. And that really fitted extremely well the Met's aim to build a new stage set for our works of art to perform to their best of abilities. And moreover, to tell the story of retail across 400 years of British decorative arts. And here you can see one example, which is our wonderful case devoted to 18th century London toy shops and the seduction of retail. So the Met, in order to attract a new audience, created a new entrance from the medieval wall so that actually people could find their way into the galleries. And visitors here are greeted by this wonderful portrait bust of Bishop John Fisher by Pietro Torrigiano, which is a nod to our colleagues at the V&A where the visitors to the British Galleries are greeted by their effigy by Torrigiano of Henry VII, which is the pair to our bust. And this was an object that is really, really important to me, and to help illustrate that, you know, it is part of the museum's mission to be up to date, because the elephant in the room, of course, when we opened the British Galleries was that it coincided with the UK's departure from the European Union. And this bust, I think, really wonderfully epitomizes Britain's complex relationship with continental Europe, because on the one hand, it represents the close artistic connection with Pietro Torrigiano, who is the, can we go back to the bust, please? Sorry. With Pietro Torrigiano being the supreme exponent of the Italian Renaissance, who really introduces the Renaissance to England, and at the same time, the complex political relationship with Europe as Torrigiano, as John Fisher, of course, lost his head because by the order of Henry VIII, because he opposed his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and the subsequent departure from the Church of Rome. And that object really helped to stress that complicated connection, not only with the rest of Europe, but also with other parts of the world. And I thought that was really, really important. And also to really emphasize that, you know, one of the reasons why the Met can justify having galleries of this scale dedicated solely to British art is precisely because it's such an international story. So if we can go to the next image, please.
I'm going to race you on a bit, Wolf.
I'm going to race for them very quickly now. Here you can see the nightclub designers at work, as it were, where you have one of our pocket galleries that really encourage a truly immersive and intimate interaction with our collection. In the next slide, you see a highly important addition, which is a room we call Tea Trade and Empire, with these cases filled with teapots. And it's a room that really evokes the chilling contrast between the humor of 18th century British decorative arts and the horrors of the slave trade, which you can also see in the next slide. And in the following slide, you will see that we really wanted to illustrate that, of course, there are always different sides to the same story. So we developed an additional narrative with first-hand accounts with relates to the atrocities of the slave trade. And then the last slide now shows the last major addition to the galleries, which is the space dedicated to the 19th century, with many new acquisitions devoted to the Great Exhibition and the aesthetic movements, etc. And I think this shot really exhibits the great theatricality of the space, and that I think is super important, because the old galleries, as you saw, were timeless, but I'm afraid also a little boring. And these aren't. I mean, they're very much of their time. They're very postmodern. They're very ephemeral. But that is as it should be, because what the museum has created here is a stage set for our works of art, in the same way our interpretation is much more of its time now, and the Met will want to be, and it shows that the Met wants to be part of today's debates and recognizes that in 10, 20, 30 years, we will hold different debates and we will have to present our collections in different ways. So to answer your question, how we want to engage them it's once visually through an immersive new architectural design, quite literally shedding new light on our collection, content-wise, developing an up-to-date narrative, and even language-wise, where we have created new engaging labels and interpretation, and in fact worked with a novelist who wrote the labels, Chris Coulson. So those are the British galleries.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to race you all through
that's all right.
such important parts. But I do think the content side of things is super, because the buildings all look gorgeous, but it is important to be discussing the content as well. One thing I wondered, Ian, when you mentioned when you showed us the Edmund de Waal show, do you get any pushback from your old visitors? I mean, do you get any what is lost, I suppose, in order to gain some of these new visitors?
There were a few complaints, and there were people just baffled. Why were these objects here? I think we chose Edmund because he's such a subtle man. I mean, his works were very beautiful. When I went to his studio in London to see them, they seemed sort of very quiet and modest. But when he put them out in the galleries, they actually had great power and strength, and so it really kind of enforced a dialogue. You could pass them by, but once you took them in, really there was the question of what they're doing there and how do they relate to the works of art. And I think, there were, in the end, very few complaints. It was a subtle enough show that people accepted it. It was a temporary exhibition. But the larger question to me is, yes, indeed, we have an older audience, by and large, that come to look at old master art at the Frick. We've been trying to widen that audience in various ways, the same way that the V&A and the Met has had initiatives. We have First Free Fridays, which brings in a younger audience. But But the question for us is both to keep this older audience and not lose the faith of them, but to move on and to try to attract the younger audience to come and see what we really have to offer. And that's what we're all really grappling with here.
Exactly, that's very interesting. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that in particular. No, great. In that case, I just wondered, Tristram, you mentioned the dreaded COVID, but one thing that has forced people to use a very different channel, which is what we're all doing today. Have you learned any lessons from that in terms of the sort of people who are engaging with you? Have you seen any new audiences through that? And do you know what you might continue, as Ian pointed out earlier?
Yes, but I think COVID has its own history now, and there was a great wave of enthusiasm for digital content in the first few weeks, and we all pumped out an awful lot, and actually people's ability to cope with the amount of content, to take in a lot of this material through the screen. I mean, looking at Wolf's galleries, they're spectacular, but how much more spectacular to be in and amongst them and looking at those teapots and looking at those Wedgwood medallions. So we know we've reached new audiences. What we've also realized is that we have a capacity now to reach more of our members. A lecture which could have 200 will now get 700. An event going around a studio which could have got 50, we can now get 250. So the ability to connect with our members and supporters through digital is enormously important. And I think we've also developed new films, new assets. But what are our challenges? Our challenges are we're never going to produce content as good as Netflix. We are all facing absolutely horrendous financial challenges now. So what are we going to cut in order to allocate money to digital relative to conservation or exhibition, all the other challenges we face? So I think we've pushed ourselves with digital, but and there will be more blended learning, there will be more blended experiences, but it's not the kind of totality. And actually, I think, coming out of this, we want, weirdly, the serendipity and the authenticity of the physical, rather than the kind of algorithmic curation of our lives through the digital. So getting that balance is going to be the interesting challenge.
Yes. If I might,
please, yes, please.
Because this is something that is quite close to my heart as well, is that I think what will be really interesting to see is when we do actually all get to return to our museums and the visitors get to return to the museums, is to make a very clear distinction between the virtual world and the real world. And I mean, the whole point of the British Galleries, as Tristram saw, is that we want the visitors to actually engage with the objects they see and not walk around the galleries with their iPhone or their iPad, just taking snapshots and walking out again. And so my hope is very much that as they then visit, they really engage with the real deal, with the real objects, after having to deal with mere reproductions on the screen for the last couple of months.
No, I think that's very interesting. Although I do think, well, I don't know, maybe Ian, you want to chip in here, because actually to a certain extent, people taking photos and putting them on Instagram helps your accessibility or helps your visibility, maybe for a smaller institution.
It does, but I've had to forbid them. So
have you? Yeah, I did.
We actually allowed the taking images at the Frick for several weeks, and I witnessed one accident after another about to happen in our relatively small spaces, where somebody was stepping back to frame an image and stepping into a ceramic vase. So we had to give that up, and Instagram is a way to reach people. So we're foregoing that. I'm clearly conflicted. I mean, I did talk about the Burchard app, which is, I think, going to be a great blessing and utility, and it is a way to deliver information succinctly to people who want it. But in the end, I want people to wander through a place like the Frick or the British Galleries, or I spent countless hours as a graduate student going through the halls of the V&A. and get lost in it. And when that person wants the information, they've fallen in love with something, they're curious, then how do we get the information to them? And that's where I think, you know, a website or a handheld device can be useful. But taking photographs, I've always, you know, I always said would rather people use their eyes rather than, you know, think that they're capturing the image on a cell phone, which they may never look at again.
I agree, and I wonder which way it will go after this sort of forced digital break, let's say, that whether people will have become addicted to looking at things through a screen or just craving seeing things in real life. And I'm an optimist. Thank you very much. Tristram, you mentioned financial challenges, and I just wondered, I would quite like to ask each of you, and we've talked about engaging new visitors, but what about new funders and new funding? And, you know, each of you will have very different structures, being, you know, private museums, public museums, US and the UK. If you could briefly set out your challenges and how you can address them now. Sorry, starting with Tristram.
So we face a big problem, which is that we've been a very successful commercial museum the last 10 to 15 years. Exhibitions, retail, cafe, licensing, and with the kind of juddering halt of the global economy, that has absolutely smashed our finances. So we're going to go to government and say, this is the national collection. These are held in trust for the nation. This is a moment when we need to work together. Absolutely, we need to cut our costs. We need to make sure all our housekeeping is done. We need to, you know, rein ourselves in, and we'll do that. But we will need government support to be able to open for the long term. We might well be able to open our doors in the coming months, but we will not be able to keep them open for the long term without extra government support to kind of take us over this bridge towards either the new normal or the vaccine or wherever we get. But this is a kind of 2-3 year crisis, and we will need extra government support. And I think one of the challenges we face in the UK is neither the tradition of big continental state and city and federal giving that Germany and Spain and France and Italy have, nor do we have quite yet the levels of incredibly generous philanthropy that you see in America, even though I know the challenge is great there. So we at the V&A, along with the other national museums, are in a bind, and my message to all masterpiece supporters is to make sure that your membership of museums and your patronage of museums remains steady. Keep the direct debits going during this period of crisis, because actually one of the great growths in income of the last 5, 10, 15 years is membership, and that's really, really significant and important for us, because we are also crucially free to entry. We don't charge any entrance fee. So even when we do open, actually it'll come at further cost.
And there's all sorts of stats about how, you know, it costs the same to open for a third of the number of people. So, you know, it doesn't help you so much. Wolf, actually, from your point of view, you do charge entry, so you've obviously lost that side of things. But how the philanthropy that Tristram mentioned, how are you finding your funders? Because some of them will also be caught up in this financially.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's a very, very tricky situation we find ourselves in. And, you know, talking about entrance fees, we may open at the end of August, but when we do, of course, the majority of the visitors are probably going to be New Yorkers who do not pay entrance fees. So and we don't know when tourists from outside New York, or indeed outside the United States, are going to return to New York. So there's a great unknown there. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, the Met is a pillar of New York's society and cultural landscape, and benefits from incredible generosity, but the deficit is enormous. And one way to do it is, of course, to try and identify sources of revenue, but we will have to tighten the belt quite dramatically in terms of exhibitions, like Tristram has mentioned for the V&A. There will be less exhibition, less activity. I mean, also because of COVID, and we don't know how this will all pan out over the course of the year, we won't have any educational programs or events inside the museum. All we will do is allow visitors to come and engage with our collections, but there won't be any programming. That, of course, will cut costs significantly, but we will also have we will have less loan exhibitions. We are going to focus on our own collection.
Yeah, which is in some ways is great and how wonderful. But I agree with you. It's a limiting prospect. Ian, before I am going to jump to people's questions, but I just wondered from your point of view, who is the next Henry Clay Frick, and how are we going to find him in this current world?
Well, I just begin by saying that I think it really is a dangerous moment for a lot of particularly smaller cultural institutions in the United States. We don't have the federal funding to the same degree that Britain does. The federal government did step in with some programs under the CARES Act, which has helped with payroll protection and things like that. Oh yes,
in the US, yes.
National Endowment for the Humanities. But as Wolf was pointing out, I mean, there will be less attendance, there will be fewer exhibitions, it will be local rather than foreign tourists who tend to spend more. So there's a several year runway here where I think there may in fact be some museums that are going to close. It'll be quite difficult for them. So we're in relatively better position at the Frick because we were planning to close anyway for a 3-year construction program, and we've been downsizing in preparation for that for 3 years. We weren't planning to have any attendance until beginning of next year anyway. So we're better placed, but will there be Henry Clay Fricks in the future? I hope so. I do see them out there. I mean, it is really it's the mainstay of American museums, the private collections and private funders who very generously over the last 150 years, thinking of the Metropolitan Museum, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year, have always made it what it is. And I don't think that's going to go away, but there's going to be a shift in the landscape. And I think, sadly, I think some of the smaller institutions will be hard put. New York City, for example, which is a very large supporter through the Department of Cultural Affairs of many of the smaller institutions in the city, is very hard hit this year. So they're not going to be able to support the institutions as well as they have in the past. And so it's a difficult moment for the United States and for Britain as well.
Thank you very, very much. There is a question that sort of follows up. Could there be a new, it comes from Prabir Roy. What is the new business model for museums post-COVID in this cash-strapped world? Where else is CapEx development funding coming from or expected to come from? I mean, it's not just cost cutting. Where else are we seeing revenues coming from? I don't know who would like to take a stab at that.
I mean, I mean, ideally in the future, if there is more digital content, there is the capacity for more sponsorship and partnership with digital providers and those who wish to access what we all have, which are incredibly attractive collections of individuals who support the museum, and that they're people want to connect with. But we always have to get this balance right, because on the one hand, we absolutely service those who support the museum, but we all have much broader public obligations to ensure that the museum feels as open and transparent and democratic as possible. So I think there's just going to be a lot less income over the coming years. My particular bugbear is I think that there has been a great deal of money made in tech in the last 10 years, and what we haven't seen, as we did see with the Fricks and the Rockefellers and the previous generations, is then the transfer of some of that money into art and culture, and the big tech money is not going into cultural institutions in the way that previous generations would support that. And we have to make the case for that more successfully. But when I see even colleagues in San Francisco and tech centers, which are also not being supported by tech money, I think there's a kind of disconnect about civic responsibility, because lots of these companies always like their headquarters to be in exciting urban areas. Well, they're exciting urban areas because they've got great cultural institutions connected to them.
Well, I think, well, those of us in the art market would very much like to see the tech companies coming in as well. I know no one's heart bleeds for the art market, but it's something we've observed here as well. It's quite interesting. Wolf, you are nodding. Do you also agree that maybe
well, I don't really have much to add to that. I think this is an extremely important observation. I was thinking about our colleagues in San Francisco as well. I think that, you know, California, which is this great tech center, I know that the institutions in Los Angeles and San Francisco find it quite challenging to try and engage potential patrons from these companies when they're making such an important contribution to cultural life there.
Yes, it concerns me about attention spans, but we'll do a whole other panel on tech, bringing tech into the art world at another time. Another interesting question here, it's posed anonymously, but I would be interested to hear what the 3 institutions are doing to diversify their workforces as well as audiences. I mean, is this an area you are looking quite keenly into? I'll start with you, Ian. Are you also looking to...
Yes, I mean, it's something that's been very much on our minds and then on the minds of many of my peer institutions. We have a strategic plan that we did last year, and that was really one of the tenets of that, to diversify our board of trustees to begin with, and senior staff and throughout. You know, we have task forces. We're appointing somebody who will have the responsibility of overseeing the diversification of our staff. You know, the question is, I mean, we were talking about it and now we actually have to do something about it. And I think that's what's been galvanizing about the protest movement of the last several months is it's forcing institutions to really undertake real change. And, you know, that's something which, you know, again, it's easy to say, but, you know, I think this is a moment that will actually lead to real change in that area.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, or in terms of, you know, does the diversifying a workforce in theory should help diversify the audience as well? I didn't think the two are mutually exclusive, but I don't know if anyone else.
I mean, the two are intimately connected, and it's about workforce, it's about programming, and it's about collections as well. Someone like the V&A, we have to think about the future of our collections acquisitions strategy and how we're reflecting the modern world, and we've got a long way to go. So I agree absolutely with Ian that this is, you know, there are processes and plans in place, but you know, this has galvanized everyone, which is only to the good.
Thank you. And Wolf, would you like to add something?
It's the point about it being so deeply intertwined is very important, because it's really only when you reach out to as broad an audience as possible that you can attract a workforce that has a very, very broad, that has very broad backgrounds. And I'm sure that Ian and Tristram will agree, is when, you know, when you're led to art at a very early age and understand that, you know, there is a career here in the museum world. That is when you know, set out your career trajectory or your educational trajectory into that direction. But if you're not brought to the museum at an early stage, you may just not realize that there are these opportunities. So there are two deeply intertwined aspects. Yes,
thank you very, very, very much. I fear, oh no, hang on, I think yes, we're going to have time for one question. So many of the questions are very, very specific. For people who've asked specific questions to the museums, I will pass these on, or we will, Masterpiece can pass these on, because I think we can get answers to you. The other question, okay, this is specifically for you, Tristram. The Raphael cartoons, this is asked by Isabel Muir. Will there be any public programming to engage a new audience? So it's all very well to sort of hang things more beautifully in more beautiful spaces, but are you having things around, and are you having things around the cartoons to sort of make an event of it?
Yes, very much so, but don't dismiss the beauty. The beauty of it will be something else as well. This is one of our COVID challenges, because we were thinking very closely about tablets, that because we've done all this incredible 3D imagery work, we've done all this photogrammetry, we've got new research into the construction of the cartoons, we've got a really great explainer for kids about the nature of the cartoons, and no one wants to touch another tablet that someone else has touched anymore. So we're having to switch this material very swiftly onto online, so that with your own phone and your own iPad, if you come into the gallery, you can research it for yourself. So absolutely, we've got, they will not sit there just isolated and pretty. We've got a very active program about it. And one of the interesting interpretations of why we have them is because Prince Albert thought of Raphael not as this singular artistic genius, but he thought of him as a craftsman and as a designer and part of a making community. So putting those cartoons within a much broader conversation about making and designing, which hopefully connects to conversations today, is absolutely what we want to achieve.
Lovely. And then I'm going to, one more. Anonymous is asking some very good questions. You mentioned Netflix. You all have incredible buildings and grounds, which might be perfect for a new series. Perhaps, I mean, collaborations, which is, I would love to talk more about, but perhaps collaborations with the film television industry might be a way forward. Is anybody thinking about along those lines? You've had some lovely things filmed.
The Met is actually quite often makes cameo appearances in film and television. So we're on the case, as it were.
Excellent. And Ian, you've had some lovely things filmed in your buildings.
We have, but I'm sort of thinking ahead of sort of the future of this. I mean, we're all over YouTube now, and how do we use that as a means to attract people more in the future and to reach out? And I think that's really where we're thinking. We have a kind of, we're a small institution, we have an in-house team that makes films, and how do we get those out? How do we use them more effectively is something we're thinking a lot about.
Yes, I mean, it's a semi-serious question, I think, exactly. It is things we may have learned now that you can capitalize on. I'm being told we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to, unfortunately, have to wrap you all up. I could talk all day. I'm sure there are lots of things to follow up on. Thank you, everyone who's been listening, but thank you very, very much indeed, Ian, Tristram, Wolf. You've been superb. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, team. Thank you.